My name is Sam Robinson, and this is the Sociocultural podcast. Thank you for joining us tonight. Once again, I always want to reiterate that all are welcome on this channel and podcast, no matter your background or belief system. We are all seeking to unveil the occulted nature of our reality and our prehistory as one collective human race. In our last podcast, we were going over the laws of spiritual evolution, the laws of manifestation, the law of seven. Now, seven is always intimately related to the what I call the occult cosmology uh, and occultism in general, such as the seven hermetic principles, the seven human vehicles of expression, or seven principles, seven human principles, like the ether body and the astral body, mental body, physical body, and so on. The seven, the nature of reincarnation, which follows also along a seven-based line and structural foundation. Like there are seven root races, there are seven earth incarnations, there are seven stages of earth incarnations with seven earths in each stage. So they also call this the 777 incarnations or scheme of incarnations through different layers and densities and spheres of reality. So, but it has come to my understanding, somewhat based on the last podcast, that I'm not sure everyone fully knows what I mean when I use the word cosmology. And it's totally understandable, though I sometimes forget that word's not used as often or as frequently as I might imagine it is because I read this stuff all the time. It's become so familiar to me as a foundational term that I typically forget that some people may not fully appreciate what I mean by cosmology as opposed to mythology or astrotheology. So we'll begin with that, and then we'll go into where we left off last time on the Lemurians, and then into the Atlantean period. And that will be what this video cast is going to be about. But let's go into what does cosmology mean? What do I mean by occult cosmology, and just in cosmology in general? I would say probably in academia and in philosophy or even science. When you say cosmology, what you're really talking about is the origins of the cosmos, or your human origin story, the narrative, the story of where humankind originates from, where the earth originates from, or even as if you want to really get deeper with it, you go to how does the cosmos originate itself, or is originated? What are the origins of the cosmos, of mankind, our solar system, and our planet? This is what cosmology is ultimately referring to, and that's the way I use the term and the definition that I would apply to the term occult cosmology. So what is an occult cosmology, or what is the occult cosmology? It is the hidden cosmology, the occulted, the secret, the mystery school's secret and hidden cosmology, origins of mankind, the universe, and the earth and the solar system. It is the one that long held within the mystery schools and mystery traditions of the ancient and modern occult traditions, and was released by Blavatsky or I think first, and then was also reiterated by Rudolf Steiner and Max Heindel and their two great books. But it had never been released before Blavatsky in 1888, as far as I'm aware, and that's what it says in her book. And there was a big kind of uproar in the mystery schools of the time, the ones that are secret anyway, the ones we're not allowed access to, especially in America, where they did not appreciate that she had released this information, and a lot of it was information that even they had never heard. But of what they did know, they did not necessarily appreciate this had been released. So, well, what would you do if you don't appreciate that? And you want this hidden cosmology and origins of mankind to be once again at least obscured, if it cannot be ultimately withheld from the masses of humanity? Well, you would generate a bullshit one. Pardon my French, which is where ancient aliens and the New Age um, nonsense teachings come in, which is a watered down, typically almost entirely fantastical, as in fantasy book style origins of humanity. But Ancient Aliens is probably the most popular. And while I fell into that for a little while in the beginning, I fell right back out when I read Blavatsky's book and realized they were trying to divert attention away from what had been released by Blavatsky 100 years before. They've done a great job. I mean, now it's everywhere. And how does it differ? What are the fundamental themes and differences in the conceptual framework that separate the occult cosmology, the hidden one in the mystery schools, from, say, not only what do you call it, mainstream science, but ancient aliens and mainstream alternative spirituality cosmologies, which they would never call it a cosmology, of course, but the origins of mankind. They don't normally go into the origins of the Earth or of the cosmos in general. What do they? What do they do? What do they do? They materialized it. They transhumanized it. They created a genetic, gene-based, genetic engineering-based cosmology, where an allegedly alien race say typically it's the Anunnaki, but you could say it's the Pleiadians or the Syrians if you're a New Ager, um, or Blue Avians if you really want to get wild. But let's just go with the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki, according to this Zachariah Stitchin engineered and fabricated story, manufactured origins story, and I read some of his books, it has taken what was a spiritual concept of spirit falling into matter, involution of spirit into matter, and made it entirely genetically engineering based and materialistic. Science, it's a version, it's a inverted version of the occulted cosmology along the lines of scientific materialistic thinking, scientific materialism, to where not only does it invert it and materialize what was a previously spiritual concept through the Anunnaki story of genetically engineering primates on Earth to become humans. It's taking the grand cosmology Blavatsky had finally released and revealed to humankind, and just not only distorting it, completely subverting it and inverting it entirely to make it no longer spiritual at all. It was no longer high philosophy. It was pseudoscience and fantasy, really. But even worse than that, it's a disempowering story. It's a disempowering narrative, because what is it saying? It's saying, along with other things in Ancient Aliens, that you didn't create these things, these wonderful monuments. You didn't create the pyramids. You didn't create the megalithic structures in the ancient world. They did. The aliens did, because obviously we're just primates genetically engineered into humans. We suck. We are inferior as a species because we clearly needed their genes to become anything even remotely um, godlike at all. Which, in the only sense we're godlike, is because we have the genes of our creator, alien, super race, supreme race, within our gene pool. So that's highly disempowering as a conceptual framework for the origins of anyone's species, and obviously ours. And it takes away all of our power, takes away and subverts the facts that we created these monuments with our own engineering, that we were the ones who mastered pyramid building and created all these megalithic structures. And it gives all the power away to this hypothetical alien species that had technology to do all these things, and that pretty much gave us civilization, gave us agricultural, gave us the first sciences, the first concepts of agrarian technology, knowledge, and learning. It all came off world. It had nothing to do with us. Humans are inferior. Humans are, in fact, pathetic, according to this narrative, and are only even as good as we are now because of our Anunnaki uh, supreme race masters and creator beings. It's horrific. It's when you really understand the occult cosmology and what they've done by propagating a tsunami of this misinformation campaign against our origin story, you will truly begin to understand how subversive it is. Because where does it lead you? It leads you into transhumanism. Because if the ultimate expression of the Anunnaki's divine powers was genetically engineering a race from primates into humans, well, then what's the power of the gods? Genetic engineering. And so that's exactly why the elites are obsessed with this idea, with technology and genetics, because they're alien gods, greatest expression of divine knowledge. It's not divine, obviously, in any sense of the word divine, but their greatest achievement and expression of their own power, according to that story, was genetic engineering and the scale of their technological advancement. So, thus, mixing the two together would show that you're like the gods, obviously, right? Obviously. So, this is one of the biggest, and this is really the fundamental reason why this is so widely propagated as a narrative, and still, so many people still fall for this stuff. So, I just wanted to bring that up. So, first we have what is the occult cosmology? It is the hidden origins of mankind, our origin stories of the Earth, the solar system, and our species. And it was secret and hidden for thousands of years, but held in the mystery schools, released by Blavatsky. And then, obviously, the reason that this is how was it rehidden or obscured at least? There was a veil thrown over it with the mass propagation of ancient aliens through Eric von Daniken in the 70s, and then New Age teachings, which literally just get into fantasy and bring up all sorts of other hypothetical um, creation narratives, from Pleiadians to Syrians to all these other races that probably don't even exist. So I just wanted to reiterate all that, as to why I'm even going into these concepts again, on the occult cosmology and the evolution of Earth and the spiritual evolution of humanity. So now that we've gone over what cosmology is and the reasons for even detailing and delineating these topics, we'll go back to we'll start in where we left off last time with the Lemurian Epoch. Okay, so this is a very important point. What has been said about the enlightenment of the Lemurians applies only to a minor portion of those who lived in the latter part of that epoch. So, according to the occult cosmology, the reason they say enlightenment is in Blavatsky's work. She talks about the sons of will and yoga, who were these beings chosen by Manu to form the seed of the next root race, the Atlantean root race. And this is how it happens every time in rhythm. It's a rhythmic cycle. That each root race, which is really a racial period of spiritual development, not an ethnicity in any sense of the word, it is a stage of development, a stage of consciousness in the development of the spiritual principles themselves. In each root race, so obviously we're starting with the Lemurians, with the first physicalized race and races. The way this entire schematic works for spiritual evolution is that the entirety of a root race does not, in any sense, turn into the next one. It's only the avant garde and the most spiritually evolved and gifted of each race, not intellectually gifted or genetically gifted or, you know, monetarily gifted, which didn't even exist then, obviously. Um, it's only the most developed that are basically, in a certain sense, picked to form the seed of the next root race. In this case, it would be the Atlanteans. And the rest of them, it's not that they fail, it's that they're just not far enough along because everything doesn't develop at a commensurate rate to every other thing or being. So, when it says what has been said about the enlightenment of the Lemurians applies only to a minor portion of those who lived in the latter part of the epoch and who became the seed for the 7 Atlantean races. What this is referring to is that in every one of these schemes, it is only a small portion, we don't know what the percentage is, of each root race that succeeds in forming a germinal group of, you know, essentially similarly developed beings that form the seed for the next root race that is going to come upon the earth. The rest basically degenerate, but there's a very important caveat here because it doesn't mean they're inferior. The greater part of the Lemurians, they say, were animal-like in the forms inhabited by them have degenerated into the well, this says savages of the present day. They don't take that literally. For the next paragraph explains what they means by this, and it's not a form of racism. The student is requested to note carefully that it was the forms, the vehicle, the physical vehicle of expression which has degenerated. There is a very important distinction to be kept in mind between the bodies or the vehicle or forms of a root race and the egos or life which incarnates in those race bodies. Everything has its time and then degenerates. That is the law of one of the laws of nature and reality. You have to have, to have new life, you must have death, which means so you have, it's one of the alchemical principles: construction, deconstruction, and then reconstruction and regeneration. Thus, you have life. It comes to its fruition, reaches its apex, then degenerates. Its forms degenerate and form the root material for a regenerated form to follow after it. Otherwise, there would be eternal stasis in the entirety of the cosmic scheme. This also has to do with the Kabbalistic concepts of Chesed and Geburah. Geburah, which is the fifth Sephiroth, is the great destroyer. It destroys all old forms and degenerated phenomenon in the universe so that there can be regeneration of a higher type of form upon every scale in reality, upon every plane and upon every being. There's always an ever increasing scale of greater development, and the vehicles are obviously a part of that scheme. And so the vehicles get better and better because it's not the body, it's not the race getting better. The ego isn't the race. The race is a vehicle for the expression of the ego itself. Thus, eventually, that vehicle is going to no longer serve its purpose as the universe continues to move on through the cycles of spiritual evolution. And thus, those vehicles will become degenerated in the sense that they no longer serve the function. In the future, they will no longer serve the same function because they won't have the capacity to serve the function of continued development. They will no longer be useful, and thus they eventually, so to speak, die out, go extinct as a vehicle, not as a being. The being still reincarnates because the being is not the body, it's the ego. When a race is born, the forms are ensouled by a certain group of spirits and have inherent capability of evolving to a certain stage of completion and no further, he says. There can be no standing still in nature. Therefore, when the limit of attainment has been reached, the bodies or forms of that race begin to degenerate. I know this is a very, I don't want to say tricky subject matter. I've had a very difficult time explaining this to people without someone thinking you're being racist or something, and that's what they were accused of by modern people, these writers, because most people cannot seem to comprehend this cosmological scheme of monads ensouling into progressively more developed vehicles for expression, and vehicles being bodies, which we call races. Which, unfortunately, because of scientific materialism and its absolute rampant ideology in our culture for the last 200 years, people identify with their race. Now, of course, now there's far more identification with things even beyond race. Obviously, total insanity in 2020, in the 2020s, and in the 21st century. But be that as it may, the first one was race identification, which is our goal to get beyond this tribalism, beyond this racial personal identification, and identify with the entirety of the human race as one brotherhood. Not force it. No, this is not. I'm not talking about communism. I'm talking about spiritual understanding, spiritual knowledge, and perception of this great truth that we are all one collective brotherhood of the human race, not human races, the human species. And the goal, and at least according to Rosicrucianism, and according to Blavatsky, and one of the fundamental theosophical, one of their three reasons for coming into existence as a society, was to teach this universal brotherhood of humanity, not to impose it on anyone politically, nationally, or internationally, simply to teach the understanding of this truth that we are one group, one mass species of spiritual evolutionary development of egos in these vehicles. It's not that we're all one, it's that we're all on the same spiritual evolutionary path together as a species, and thus, in a certain sense, we are all one. Of course, the entire universe is all one and all not one in the manifested cosmos. Um, but that's not what we're talking about here. To get beyond tribalism, to get beyond nationalism, was one of the goals of both Rosicrucians and the Theosophical Society, was to teach the idea, not creating a one world government, which some people have accused them of. No, it's teaching the spiritual understanding and knowledge of the fact that we can go beyond those concepts within ourselves, not superimpose them on anyone else, or create some sort of man-made international structure of one group concept. It's more like a spiritual perception and understanding, um, more than anything else. Then the idea of forcing it would have been repugnant to Blavatsky and Rosicrucians of the time, and would negate the entire idea of spiritual evolution, because it's supposed to happen naturally. You cannot force it. You cannot fast forward it. You cannot hasten the process. There's a forcing of this process, which is exactly what the elites want to do. Is force this process. They want to quicken spiritual evolution by hijacking it and thinking that they know better and how to make it happen faster. And really, they're just talking with dark interdimensional entities who have their own agenda and want to devolve us so that they can and basically enslave us. But as I was saying, when a race is born that forms and sold by a certain group of spirits, because there's what they call life waves, have inherent capability of evolving to a certain stage of completion and no further. There can be no standing still in nature. Therefore, when the limit of attainment has been reached, the bodies or forms of that race begin to degenerate, seeking lower and lower, until at last the race dies out, the vehicle dies out. The reason is not far to seek. New race bodies or vehicles of expression for the developing monads are particularly flexible and plastic, affording greater scope for the egos who then incarnate in them to improve those vehicles and progress thereby by gaining ego experience for the monad. The most advanced egos, advanced seemingly just in this evolutionary scheme, not advanced in terms of better, because all monads will reach the same stages over time anyway. But there's a first batch, or so they call it, life wave of monads that come in initially. And then there's ones that follow upon that. So there are some that were just simply there first. That's all I mean by advanced. It doesn't mean like genetically advanced, racially superior, or anything like that. It simply means they're simply were the first monads there, so thus they're further along and thus more developed, and the ones behind them will reach the exact same stage anyway, as the cycle continues. But the most advanced egos are brought to birth in such bodies and improve them to the best of their ability. These egos, however, are only apprentices as yet, and they cause the bodies to gradually crystallize, which means to harden to fully kind of an over concretion of the physicality of the body until the limit of improvement of that particular kind of body, think vehicle of expression, has been reached. And then forms for another new race are created to afford the advancing egos further scope for more extended experience and even greater spiritual evolutionary development. They discard the old race bodies, old vehicles for the new, their discarded bodies becoming the habitation for the less advanced egos, who will eventually get greater bodies in the future, greater vehicles, who in their turn use them as stepping stones, meaning the less developed egos or monads use the discarded body vehicles by the more developed monads as stepping stones on their part of the path of progress. Thus, the old race bodies are used by egos of increasing inferiority, simply meaning less developed, gradually degenerating into a last there are no egos, no monads, no divine sparks low enough to profit by incarnating in that vehicle. And then that vehicle slash race as a body dies out because it can no longer serve the purpose for human monads reincarnating to gain greater development. That's all that it means. I know it's kind of an advanced concept, but it's just very pivotal to understand. I mean, and you can tell this guy's not racist. It says the whites have been guilty of fearful oppression towards those other races, having in many cases massacred multitudes of defenseless and unsuspecting natives, as witnessed the conduct of the Spaniards toward the ancient Peruvians and Mexicans, to specify but one of many instances. By no means are they disregarding or and unacknowledging what's been done by British, Spanish, basically white Anglo-Saxon Europeans, and what they've done to supposedly older bodies. Okay, now we're going to go to the Atlantean Epoch. And okay, one of the last things it says in this chapter is science speaks only of evolution. It fails to consider the lines of degeneration, which are slowly but surely destroying such bodies as have crystallized beyond the possibility of improvement. That kind of sums the entire concept up to me. Now we are going into Atlantis and the Atlantean Epoch. Volcanic cataclysms destroyed the greater part of the Lemurian continent. This is known in the Occult Cosmology. And in its stead rose the Atlantean continent, not in the same place, but in a different part of the globe, where the Atlantic Ocean is now. If you want to know where the majority of the true research for the where Atlantis would have been, an exact area, there is an area in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, on the Mid Atlantic Ridge, which is the line that runs down the middle of the volcanic tectonic separation of plates that runs straight down the middle of the Atlantic. And there's an island there in the middle called the Azores, Azores. And that is where the continent would have been. Of course, expanded much further outwards, obviously, in a huge degree. Any other speculation is nonsense. It was these, and it extended all the way to the Bermuda Triangle and all the way over to, what you would consider like, North Africa and into Western Europe. As he says, material scientists impelled by the story of Plato have undertaken research regarding Atlantis and have demonstrated that there is ample foundation, scientific foundation, for the story that such a continent definitely existed. Cold scientists know that it existed and also know that the conditions there were such as shall now be described. Ancient Atlantis differed greatly from our present world in many ways, but the greatest difference was the atmosphere, the constitution or density of the atmosphere and water in this Atlantean age and epoch. It was very different than it is now. Even though the world was material and materialized, it still wasn't quite as dense as it is now in our time frame. Granted, according to the Blavatsky narrative in Occult Cosmology, it was a long, long time ago, tens of thousands of years. Some don't agree with that. But either way, the continent of Atlantis was the meeting place of two currents from volcanic air and activity and icy blasts from the polar region. And this mixture created a type of thick, murky fog, kind of like a hazy mist that covered the entirety of the continent until much later in the Atlantean period. And thus, obviously, the sun was not nearly as visible or barely visible at all, and certainly not directly visible through this misty fog that covered the entirety of the Atlantean continent for a large part of its existence. The water was not so dense as it is now, but became a greater proportion of air. Much water was also held in suspension in the heavy fog of the Atlantean atmosphere. Through this atmosphere, the sun was never clearly able to be seen. It appeared to be surrounded by an aura of light mist, as street lamps do during fog. Man was guided more by an internal perception than by external vision at this time, though obviously they could see. And they still had some of their residual psychic abilities, certainly in the first few stages of the Atlantean root races. They were still, to a degree, fairly psychic and had, to some degree, a power over their natural prana or chi, and over the life, which is the life force, and over the life force of nature. Man of that time was very different from the existing on the earth at the present time. They were massive. They were considered, and they were the giants in all the stories of old. You know, people talk about Nephilim. These were the giants that are mentioned in biblical stories, the giants mentioned in Native American stories, the giants mentioned in all sorts of ancient culture stories, and even the giants that have been found. The Atlanteans were giants. So, thus, what does that mean? We were giants. We were the giants as monads incarnating in the Atlantean bodies themselves or vehicles. Thus, we were the giants. And what does that mean? That means there were no aliens building any of these wonderful superstructures and megalithic structures. It was us. And they've stolen that history from us through the ancient alien narrative. They've taken our achievements away from us. The remnants of the Atlanteans are largely considered in the occult cosmology to have built these massive structures with these huge megalithic foundation stones that are sometimes several hundred tons, hundreds of thousands of pounds each, and that's how they were able to move them. It's not from technology; so they were giants. They were massive human forms that eventually died out and were replaced by the smaller ones of the next root race, the Aryan root race. Aryan with a Y, not with an I, and it has nothing to do with a supreme racial concept. That's just what the name of the next root races. The entire period is the Aryan, but obviously there were always some remnants of a root race left behind, as the next one rises. Nothing ever dies out all at once. Even though their continent sank, there were some left, and you could easily chalk up these Anunnaki stories if you see the cuneiform and cylinder seals of the Sumerians. They show these giant humans that they call the Anunnaki, the gods, who brought them civilization and agriculture and all these technologies. And there's stories like this around in the Aztecs. They call about Quetzalcoatl and various other cultures. If you study this kind of thing, they all talked about these huge humanoids who were largely, I think, white, bearded, and if you look at the cylinder seals of the Sumerians, they were bearded and they towered over the human ones. They had so to speak, and the hierarchies beneath them. They're like this big, and then they're like that big. I mean, they're massive compared to the other people depicted in these cylinder seals of the Sumerians. That doesn't mean that they're aliens coming from space who gave them technology. It means they were prior Atlanteans from their own Atlantean civilization who still had some of the remnants and residuals of their civilization. They retained some even after the destruction, and they brought it to these people and taught them, and then died out. And they were considered gods, obviously, because they were like 10 feet tall and had this advanced information, and they passed it on in all different parts of the world. That is what the Anunnaki really were. As compared with our present humanity, he was a giant. His arms and legs were much longer in proportion to his body than ours. Instead of walking, he progressed by a series of flying leaps. He had small blinking eyes, and his hair was round. The latter peculiarity, if no other, distinguishes the descendants of the Atlantean races who remain with us at the present day. The hair was straight, glossy, black, and round in section. That of the Aryan, though it made different colors, always oval in section. This is what he says. The ears of the Atlanteans sat much further back upon the head than those do of the Aryan root races. The higher vehicles of the early Atlanteans were not drawn into a concentric position in relation to the dense body as ours is. The spirit was not quite an indwelling spirit, it was partially outside, therefore cannot control its vehicles with as great a facility as though it dwelled entirely inside. The head of the vital body was outside of and held a position far above the physical head. There was a point between the eyebrows and about half an inch below the surface of the skin, which has a corresponding point in the vital body. This is not the pituitary body, which lies much deeper in the head. When these 2 points in the dense and vital bodies come into correspondence, as they do in man today, the trained clairvoyant sees them as a black spot rather than as a vacant space. This is the seat of the indwelling spirit in the man, the Holy of Holies in the temple of the human body, and the indwelling human monadic ego. This is the Isis whose veil none may lift. Not even the highest evolved being on earth is capable of unveiling the ego of the humblest and least developed creature. On account of the distance between these 2 points in the vital and the dense body, the Atlantean power of perception or vision was much keener in the inner worlds than in the dense physical world. Like I said, they were still psychic, obscured by this thick, heavy fog over there in the majority of their continent. In the fullness of time, however, the atmosphere slowly became clear, and this fog mist dissipated, and at the same time, the point in the vital body came closer and closer to corresponding to the point in the dense body. As the two approached each other, man gradually lost touch with and lost his psychic abilities. As you progress through the Atlantean root race, they start to have the germ of mind and much greater physical perception, but lose their psychic perceptions. Their what do they call it? Extrasensory perception goes downhill, but their intellect and mind starts to become fully germinated. They became dimmer as the physical world became clearer and outlined and reached peak materiality. Finally, in the last third of the Atlantean Epoch, the point in the vital body was united and corresponded with the point in the dense body. And then they became fully awake in the dense physical world. But their full sight and perception of the physical world were gained at the expense of the inner worlds, was gradually lost to most of the Atlantean people and to most of us. Now, obviously, this is what people are talking about when they say you can reawaken these things, because it's still a latent potential. While in these older Atlantean and Lemurian times, that was how we interacted with the world. And as the world materialized, we no longer needed those specifically to interact with this world. as it became less spiritual and more material. We gained the material um, sense perception, abilities for sense perception at the expense of those going dormant. They were not lost. They went into dormancy because they were technically no longer needed by the majority of the human race, or really to exist within the fully materialized world that they found themselves in. Yet they remained there in potential to be reactivated as they are in the mystery schools. Another interesting thing he says is that in earlier time, the Atlantean did not clearly perceive an outline of an object or person, but he saw the soul at once and knew its attributes, whether they were beneficial to him or otherwise. He knew whether the man or animal he was looking at was hostile or kind, or kindly in terms him, basically, towards him. He was accurately taught by spiritual perception how to deal with others and how to escape harm. Therefore, when the spiritual world gradually faded as an ability and went dormant, it was a loss. And then here's a specific name. The Ramahals were the first of the Atlantean races. They had but little memory, and that little was chiefly connected with sensation. They remembered colors and tones, and thus, to some extent, they evolved feeling. The Lemurian had entirely lacked feeling in the finer significance of the word itself. He had the sense of touch, could feel the physical sensations of pain, ease of comfort, but not the mental and spiritual ones of joy, sorrow, sympathy, and antipathy. With memory came to the Atlanteans the rudiments of language. That's where the origin of language really starts, is in the Atlantean Age and Epoch. They evolved words and no longer made use of mere sounds as Lemurians did. But remember, to the Lemurian age, those sounds could control the life force and mold the still, to a degree, plastic world around them. Plastic meaning like plasticity. They were, as yet, the Romahals began to give names to things. They were yet a spiritual race, the initial Atlanteans, and their soul powers being like the forces of nature itself. They not only named the objects around them, but in their words was power over the things they named. Like the last of the Lemurians, as we were talking about, their feelings as spirits inspired them in no harm. To them, the language was holy as the highest direct expression of their inner spirit. And in the beginning, the power was never abused. In the future, obviously, we'll find that it was highly abused. By the use of definite language, the soul in this first Atlantean race became able to contact the soul of things in the outside world. Then there's the Tlavatlis, the second Atlantean race. They began to feel their own individuality and separateness as human beings. They became ambitious. They demanded their works be remembered. And this is where I talked about in the last podcast ancestry worship. It became a factor in the life of their community. The remembrance of deeds done by certain ones would cause a group of people to choose their leader as one who had done great deeds. This was the germ of royalty. And this remembrance of the meritorious deeds of great men was carried even beyond the time when such leaders even died. Mankind began to honor the memory of their ancestors and to worship them and others who had shown great merit. Still kind of goes on today. This is the beginning of a form of worship which is practiced to this day by some of the Asiatics. The Toltecs were the third Atlantean race. They carried still further the ideas of their predecessors, inaugurating monarchy and hereditary succession. The Toltecs originated the custom of honoring men for the deeds done by their ancestors. Okay, so because of the peculiar training at that time, the father, this is when I was talking about hereditary succession and monarchy being established. The peculiar training at the time, the father had actually the power to bestow his qualities upon his son in a way impossible today during our period of mankind. The education consisted of calling up before the soul of the child pictures of the different phases of life. The consciousness of the early Atlanteans was as yet principally an internal picture consciousness. The power of the educator to call up these pictures before the soul of the child was the determining factor upon which depended the soul qualities that would be possessed by the adult man. The instinct and not the reason was appealed to and aroused, and by this method, the education of the son really absorbed the qualities of the father, quite literally. It is thus evident that there was at this time good reason for bestowing honor upon the descendants of great men. This is not the case now. We have no reason whatsoever for continuing this process, this kind of ancestral worship, except in a very, general way. Experience became extremely valued among the Atlanteans. The one with the most varied and widespread level of experience was the one most honored and sought after. Memory was then so great and accurate that our present memory is literally nothing in comparison to their memory. Their level of memory was practically, it was like they all had um, a perfect memory. Well, we rarely are able to pull that off. We almost never can pull that off. A photographic memory was basically what they had. They couldn't really reason out an experiment through an intellectual theoretical processes like we do. They had to go based on previous experience, and thus the men with that experience were the ones that were most sought after as advisors and builders and everything else that you would associate with that. In the middle of the in the middle third of Atlantis was the beginning of the separation into nation states. Okay, not it's nation states, but into nations. Groups of people discovered one another with similar tastes and traits and beliefs and habits, would leave their homes and found a new colony. They remembered their old customs and followed them to their new homes. The leaders of mankind. It was at this time that the leaders of mankind initiated great kings to rule over their people. The masses honored these kings with all the reverence due to true kings by the grace of God. Unfortunately, this led to the seed. This was the germinal seed of their eventual destruction because these kings amassed great power and forgot their sacred trust to the people that they supposedly served, and they began to use their power in a very in a corrupt fashion for selfish ends. They forgot that this trust had been put into them by their people, and they began to use their power in a very corrupt and selfish fashion for personal aggrandizement and the accumulation of wealth and privileges and authorities never intended for these kings. Ambitious and selfishness ruled them, so to a large extent, they obviously abused their divinely derived powers for the purposes of oppression and revenge. This was also true of the aristocracy and the nobles and higher classes when one considers the powers they possessed over their fellow human beings. And misuses would bring terrible consequences and conditions upon the Atlantean people eventually. The fourth Atlantis race was called the Turanians. They were especially vile in their abominable selfishness. They erected temples where the kings were worshipped as gods, and they caused extreme oppression of the lower classes. Black magic of the worst kind was at its heyday during this time period and flourished everywhere, along with, and it was all along with huge external displays and gratification of their vanity. They erected enormous statues of themselves, engaged in all sorts of what we see today, you know, selfish, materialistic worship of yourself in your own vanity. And now this is specifically from Max Heindel. We cannot necessarily corroborate this next part. The original Semites were the fifth and most important of the seven Atlantean races, the Semites, meaning the Jews, because in them they find the first germ and corrective quality of thought. Therefore, the original Semitic race became the seed race for the seven races of the next root race, the Aryan Epoch. The mind was the one specifically being developed, the intellect and the reason, the mental body during the Atlantean Epoch. And the ego was exceedingly weak and the desire nature strong. The nascent mind coalesced within the desire body. Thus, the first faculty that was going to be developed in the mental body, or was developed as an occurrence of this, was cunning, and was the cause of all the wickedness of the middle third of the Atlantean age. The Aryan Epoch, thought and reason were to be evolved by the work of the monadic ego to conduct the desire into channels leading to the attainment of spiritual perfection, which was the goal of spiritual evolution. This faculty of thought, the forming of ideas, was gained by man at the expense and loss of control over the vital forces, which means specifically they lost their power over nature. The ability to mold nature and their latent and their psychic abilities became latent in exchange for gaining the ability to come up with ideas and to think and to intellectualize and to reason. With thought in mind, man can at present exercise powers over the chemicals and minerals only, for his mind is now in the first and mineral stage of its evolution. He can exercise no power over plant and animal life, which he could before in the earliest parts of the Atlantean Epoch and the Lemurian Epoch. Thus, these substances are all, on the final analysis, chemical matter and soul by mineral life, of which the bodies of all the kingdoms are composed. It was this very loss of over the power of the vital forces which the Atlanteans suffered that made it possible for man to actually evolve further along his spiritual evolutionary path. No matter how great his selfishness became, it could not prove absolutely destructive of himself and nature because he had lost the ability to fully control nature with the vital power. And a thought that works only in man is powerless to command nature and can never endanger humanity as would be possible were nature forces still under man's control along with having the ability of thought power. Unfortunately, the original Semites regulated their desires to some extent by the mind, and instead of mere desire came cunning and craftiness, the means by which those people sought to attain their selfish ends. Though they were a very turbulent people, they learned to curb their passions to a great extent and accomplished their purposes by the use of cunning, more subtle and potent than mere brute strength. They were the first to discover that brain is superior to brawn. During the existence of this fifth subrace, the Semitic race, the atmosphere of Atlantis commenced to clear definitely, and the previously mentioned point in the vital body fully corresponded in the dense body. The combination of these events gave man the ability to see objects clearly with sharp, well-defined definition. But they lost the sight of the inner worlds and the spiritual planes. No progress is this is an axiom. No progress is ever made that is not gained at the cost of some previously possessed faculty, which is later regained much later in a higher form. They built the brain at the expense of the temporary loss of the power to bring forth their psychic abilities. Reason benefited him in many ways. It shut his vision from the soul of things, though. The exchange of spiritual powers for physical powers was necessary, of course, to master the physical and material plane itself. And now we are in an era where we're supposed to be we're at the very beginning of regaining some of those abilities now that we've mastered the physical plane. The Akkadians were the sixth root race, the Mongolians, apparently the seventh Atlantean race. They evolved the faculty of thought even further, but followed lines of reasoning which deviated more and more from the main trend of developing life. Progress constantly requires new methods and continued adaptability of these principles and keeping ideas in a fluid state. Therefore, races fell behind and are degenerating with the remainder of the Atlantean races simply because they became overly crystallized in their ways of thinking as they were developing thinking itself. As the heavy fogs of Atlantis condensed more, the increased quantity of water gradually inundated the continent, destroying the greater part of the population and evidence of their entire civilization. they sank. As we all know in the story of Atlantis, there's the sinking of the great Atlantean continent. They were driven from the doomed continent by the floods, and they went to Europe. This is why when Blavatsky talks about how there is a perennial tradition in of religions, it's because the seed of the religions came from Atlantis, because they fled in all different directions when their doomed continent sank. This is why there's stories, many stories from very many different cultures surrounding the area where Atlantis would have been on all sides. Spoke of groups of people, groups of men, seeming like gods came and taught them the beginnings of civilization, and why there's basically a grain of truth, or the seeds of the original tradition, some seeds in each world religion, while the actual original tradition was basically only kept alive, supposedly, in the Himalayas within some of these secret Asiatic